Hi there, thanks for tuning in. My name is Rosanna Bellini. I'm a third year PhD student at Open Lab at Newcastle University, and I'm going to be presenting this paper on behalf of my collaborators. Okay, so domestic abuse is and never has been an edge case to consider in technical design. It affects millions of people every year, and in 2009, domestic abuse affected 2.4 million adults in the UK alone. And in the past couple of years, as scholars, we've developed new conceptualizations for coercive control online. We've also collected detailed accounts of how victim survivors experience technology-facilitated abuse, and then we've also begun to develop some digital strategies to combat abuse through scanning victim survivors' devices for account compromise and spyware on their personal devices. The majority of this kind of work within HCI has been victim-centric and for organisations to better keep victim survivors safe. But also alongside this, that building on this work, that we as researchers and designers actually must also challenge the abuse at its source, which is addressing perpetrators of domestic abuse and holding them responsible for their abusive actions, but also providing them with the support required to change their behaviours. So this really powerful quote by Jeffrey Edelston really gets to the heart of the issue, which is that it's unfair to characterise our collective failure to rein in abusive men as battered women's failure to act. Why not ask the abuser's willingness and capacity to initiate change and eliminate the danger he has created? So I'm just going to acknowledge that Jeffrey here uses gendered pronouns, and that's because domestic violence is an extremely gendered crime, where the overwhelming majority of perpetrators are men, but there are also both female perpetrators and male victims that we also need to take into the equation. But how do we work with perpetrators? Well, most preventative work at its very core tries to teach people who use abusive behaviours that they actually have the capacity to choose alternatives to abuse and violence. And I saw kind of a potential in the fact that interactive storytelling have actually kind of allowed players to kind of operate within kind of a magic circle where there's a clear separation between virtual and real events, and this can help to reduce traumatizing impacts from upsetting topics. And that's just in response to actually how do we actually explore these kind of alternatives to violence sensitively as well. If you're talking about someone's capacity to change, you need to provide sensible alternatives. But we also don't want this kind of distance to be too far as to risk not being meaningful for the player. So through second-person perspectives, where you as the player can engage with the story, this can help to abstract and connect the player with content material. So key examples of this being Choose Your Own Adventure and Black Mirror, which was airing on Netflix. So these kind of combination of kind of different factors and topics, I actually saw kind of considerable potential in this simultaneous abstraction and connection to the content on domestic violence and the role of choice in games that could play to communicate in understanding about choice for violence in real life. So I and the project team designed Choice Point, which is a gameful web and mobile-based system that actually permits a group of players in the same physical environment to play through co-designed fictional narrative, and we provided participants with pre-assigned characters that encounter choice points at different stages of the story. And these were different points where they could choose from a series of options, and that meant changing the shape of the story and the impact on the story's outcome. So this was hosted by a facilitator on a work laptop, and ideally participants could use their own mobile devices to join either as a character, where they can discreetly select an option for the story to progress based on that character, or an audience could join, they could join as an audience member, and vote on their kind of preferred option after a participant playing a particular character is chosen. So with our charity partners, which is Bernardo's, we told a story comprised of real elements of stories of domestic violence. And this was told through a family unit, which is Terry, Sharon, and as the parents, and then Tracy and Sean as their two children, whose story begins at the dinner table, where tensions have been rising due to pressures placed on both the parents, and Terry starts to insult Sharon in front of their two children. Importantly for the scenario, based on victim accounts, If the participant playing Terry continuously selects negative options such as insults, threats, or physical violence, the choices of Sharon and their 2 children have visibly restricted set of options to choose from, reflecting the impact of coercive and controlling behaviours on others. So, for example, if Terry threatens Sharon, the son Sean no longer feels confident enough to leave the house and visit a friend's house out of concern for his mum. Okay, so how could Choice Point support real efforts to challenge abusive behaviours on the front line? Well, we explored this through 3 ways. So we first hosted a focus group for victim survivors to critique our design of Choice Point and the content of the non-linear narrative, and this was to ensure it matched the real experiences of victim survivors. We then did 2 design workshops with 4 facilitators of perpetrator interventions, where we identified accessibility or safeguarding concerns in the tool in order to not escalate risk for existing or future victim survivors. And then they also identified a suitable intervention for where Choice Point could be used. And this was Steps Towards Change, and this is ran by Bernardo's. So this is an educational course for perpetrators to be directly challenged on their behaviour through learning about the health risks of using and experiencing violence, but also equipping them with practical strategies to pick alternatives other than violence in their intimate relationships. And we've ran Choice Point within these 3 groups of perpetrators for 27 men within these sessions. Okay, so what did we find? Well, through the use of Choice Point and discussions of the narrative within the story, many perpetrators in the Steps Towards Change programme spoke about topics that were notably more sensitive, personal and reflective in comparison to the control groups who did not receive this intervention, according to staff members. So in many ways, facilitators actually recognise that Choice Point across all deployments as providing this protective cover for the men to discuss their experiences with violence that they were challenged to bring out otherwise. And in fact, this kind of connection between virtual and real events that I theorised could previously happen was actually so strong that many men actually broke their character when justifying why they had chosen a particular choice within the scenario. So Lenny here in one of the groups says, I am Terry and I feel a terrible sense of guilt, total remorse, which I hadn't felt at all the other times I'd hit her. I should note that we didn't write physical violence within our fictional scenario. And now I've got the kids and police involved and I feel like everyone's going to judge me. Terry is the bad person. So Lenny actually breaks a character from Terry to the use of this personal pronoun, and he actually describes his own violence. So Choice Point here can be seen as providing an environment for sharing uncomfortable disclosures and reality. I should note here that talking about violence doesn't equate to behaviour change, but it is a very important first step in accepting and seeking out help to further improve behaviour. While there was a value in the story facilitating a comfortable space to talk about uncomfortable topics, facilitators and victim survivors also noted not to make this process too painless either. And Emma states here, who's a facilitator of these programs, said even if they're not kind of owning up to it, meaning their own violence, through Choice Point, maybe it's still beneficial. You don't want them to feel too relaxed though, as then that's not taking their abuse seriously and it's letting them off easy. So there's an interesting kind of balancing act between what's uncomfortable and what's comfortable enough for a disclosure, but not actually condoning violence. We also found that many facilitators and victims appreciated that there was very clear constraints to the story that actually gave them the feeling that they were in control of the story and assigning kind of predefined characters and actions and scenarios within the system to the perpetrators. So Melissa here actually contributes that as Choice Point restricted the options, not only due to characters, but between kind of 3 to 5 choices at each kind of key choice point. She states that with not that much choice, the men can remove themselves on what stories they might spin to themselves about violence, and it really does take them outside of their world. So this very careful transportation of moving someone outside of their world through fictional narrative was also reflected in our victim survivor group, where many victim survivors stated that, kind of in line with the facilitators, that if perpetrators were left to construct a scenario of their own abuse, such as what stories they might spin themselves in terms of talking about alternatives to violence. Perpetrators would unfortunately inevitably exclude the perspectives of others and manipulate the story to portray themselves as the victim to avoid responsibility. So Julie states here, with this you can't really play the victim because you've got other viewpoints to think about. The story is already written and you can't change it to suit you. So again, there's another balance here, which is the balance of control. So perpetrators still had the opportunity to exert control, choice and influence to shape the course of the story. But this was notably within the bounds of the story itself. So noticeably, this kind of design choice of actually restricting control from the users had a positive impact on how they understood their own violence. And this was a case of, rather than promote the frequently mythical belief that there's no other option other than to use violence, many men actually identified their agency and capacity to control the course of the story and their violence in real life. So Mark here reports you could have gone 10 or 20 different stories, but ultimately you have the choice to, choose differently. And Rashid responds by saying, I think that we really underestimate ourselves as to how much control we've got of our decisions here, because it's what we do that affects the outcome. Mark responds with, yeah, because it's your choice. Okay, so what does this study mean in the context of other work? Well, in HCI studies, there's a lot of work that seeks to promote that increasing user agency is a value in and of itself. And this is where we've seen in interactive storytelling, where it prides itself on providing and creating new forms of player agency by actually allowing players a greater stake in how the story is shaped through choice and representation. But we found within our work there's a real direct challenge to this emancipatory vision, which is that if perpetrators were left to their own devices to design their own narratives and own alternatives to violence, perpetrators would ultimately spin the narrative to present themselves as a victim and actually undermine efforts that teach them that violence is a choice that rests on the shoulders of them. And in fact, to kind of combat this, staff facilitators and victim survivors actually praised the restricted agency that perpetrators had in the narrative for the outcome of realising that they actually had the agency or the choice to be non-abusive in reality. So in removing kind of potential harmful or distracting material that could lead to negative behaviours, such as the work that we've already seen in digital self-care, we think that this coincides with where the user believes that they actually had more agency to perform other more positive tasks, such as desisting from violence. So as such, we believe that confining pre-written narratives of abuse and violence, yet allowing users to partake in the story through the provision of character roles, may ensure that the tone and narrative are coherent with such a sensitive setting. And as I've demonstrated, if done properly, there is a clear benefit in positioning kind of hypotheticals or what-ifs on sensitive topics, such as alternatives to violence, such as using violence against others, within a magical circle of possibilities within interactive storytelling that is notably not ethical or legal to actually occur in real life. And I should note, just because the events do not exist in reality, I'm not meaning that they should be discounted or unreliable or meaningless. Our use of kind of the magical circle concept in our work doesn't imply that the boundary between real or virtual are fixed or permanent. As I found, many perpetrators connected so strongly with the narrative that they were willing to disclose aspects about themselves in ways that facilitators did not see with the control group. So as such, we call on researchers, designers and policymakers to provide physical, virtual and social spaces of negotiation for perpetrators to realise for the severity of abuse for themselves, and that would ideally be done within professional domestic violence settings as well. So through my kind of focus to explicitly focus on designing a system for perpetrators, which was guided by the expertise of both service facilitators and victim survivors, I've I've sought to show that it can be appropriate and I'd argue even necessary to directly design interventions for this social group within HCI. I'm actually quite excited to see how we can evaluate such a system to actually determine real behaviour change to better inform behaviour change interventions. So that's all that time will allow for now. Thanks very much for listening, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any further questions. Thanks, and bye for now.